This is the Agoro Carbon Farming Podcast. Agoro Carbon Alliance is taking action on a global scale to reverse the effects of climate change by decarbonizing farming and restoring carbon to the world's soil. On this podcast, we're going to explore carbon farming from the soil to the atmosphere and how it affects everyone in between. To learn more, visit us at agorocarbonalliance.com. Welcome to another edition of the Carbon Farming Podcast, and we are going to talk about an area, a geography within the U.S., and get real specific on some of the challenges and some of the opportunities within this area. We have John Pullis and Steve Hasselman, and they're agronomists, and they're joining us to lend us some knowledge and help us understand this geographic region, which we'll call the Corn Belt, but we'll kind of get a little more specific as we go on. Steve has a CCA with roots in his family farming from Northern Illinois. He covers the Illinois and Southern Wisconsin region. John Pullis has an MS in soil science, which I want to dig into a little bit. I'm kind of involved in soil science over at Yara, with an expertise in soil fertility, nitrogen management, and precision agriculture. A lot of really good experience between John and Steve, and we're going to get into that. Let's just start off first of all, John, as you're going throughout the Corn Belt, what are some of the challenges that you hear with producers as you're talking to them about carbon farming?
Yeah, I think part of it is the first step is identifying what is meant by carbon farming, right? So a big part of what we do on a daily basis is educate growers on what is a carbon market, what is a carbon credit, and what is carbon farming. And so understanding carbon farming has, similar names or additional names that could be used, such as regenerative agriculture or conservation practices, that a lot of times these are talking about the exact same practice. And so part of it, I live in Michigan, which is in a northern climate. And so some of the challenges that I, have to deal with growers in our area is understanding how do we adapt or how do we adopt some of these practices with a shorter growing season or with some additional challenges in our area. And so part of that is understanding if we're looking at something like cover cropping, sometimes we're taking corn off in October and November, and there is not much of a window for growth for a cover crop planted after harvest. And so that's really where we've had to be a little creative and try to find some, species that are winter hardy that work well as a cover crop, or look at additional ways to get the cover crop on the field before harvest. And sometimes that looks like aerial application. Sometimes, growers have been very successful and very innovative in finding ways to adopt or modify their equipment in order to apply seed earlier in the season, whether it's with side dress application or, just high clearance equipment to go over the field, at different times and apply cover crop seed during the season to get it an early start before harvest.
If we have a listener that lives in this geography or maybe lives outside the geography that's listening to this and saying, my family's been farming this land. We've been growing the same crops for generations. Adding this carbon farming aspect to my farm seems complicated. It seems very intense, and maybe it's not right for me. What kind of suggestions would you give them, John?
Well, coming from precision ag background, I was used to working with farmers that had varied soils, right? So there's sandy areas, there's clay areas, there's maybe some muck. But the commonality that I saw a lot of times is, we're making management decisions that are looking at areas that are low in productivity and making management decisions that are reducing what we're doing in those areas because we know that there's limiting factors to the yield potential. So I look at carbon farming and some of these regenerative ag practices, and I say, what is the value we can assign to making these modifications to our farming system? What does that look like if we're able to increase organic matter? What does that mean if we're able to expect higher yield or have a higher potential for yield in areas that we've always discounted in the past? What does that mean for longer, hybrids or longer growing season, hybrids that can grow, that can be planted earlier because of soil conditions from these practices? So I like to assign a value, that looks at all the aspects of what these practices can provide and where a grower starts at now. The beauty is, right, I mean, we're asking farmers, or farmers are being asked to make a change, and change is hard.
Mm-hmm.
I'm one of those people, if I see an advertisement or, a speaker talk about make this easy change in farming, just makes my skin crawl, because I know there is not an easy change in farming. Growers are doing a great job as they are, but some of these practices, require modifications or require changes, and growers need to be upfront about what it takes, and the assistance that's available. And that's really where I really love working with Agrocarbon, because we're there to walk with these growers along this path of making this change. This is not go it alone. This is not you figure it out. We're not going to be an 800 number that you're going to call 9 to 5 to figure it out. We're going to be somebody that's along with them on this path to finding out how to make these practices work on their operations. And so that's really where I see a lot of value in getting some of these practices tried, and then seeing, where they can really benefit the operation.
Steve, I love that Agoro is based on agronomics. And we're not just out there trying to sell a farmer on a program where they can maybe make money doing some carbon sequestration, but we're also helping them make change practices in their farming operation that is going to help them agronomically. What problems do you see as you're going out and talking to farmers and trying to educate them? Do they understand that there is a symbiotic relationship between carbon farming and improving the crops agronomically?
Yeah, for sure. Most of them do understand that, but it still can be a hurdle to take that extra step and take on that risk that can come with some of these practice changes. We've done a pretty good job of explaining what practices we're promoting. It's tillage reductions, it's cover crop introduction, and those are all things that are shown to improve soil structure and build organic matter, which is the soil's productivity, that organic matter component. So, it can still be just a little bit scary to take those tillage passes out. Like John had mentioned, there are some equipment updates that a lot of times need to take place on the planters, especially to get into some of those tougher soil conditions and do a good job of planting. So that's why we're here. In addition to offering some financial assistance, we are the boots on the ground with experience with farmers that have made these changes in the past. All of us on the team, I think, have experience with, conventional till and non-cover crop using farmers that have decided to incorporate these new practices. We've seen what works, we've seen what doesn't work, and we've taken good notes with it. So, having that in our back pocket, I guess, knowing that we're going to be able to be with them and help them through it, that's been huge in securing the confidence to make that next step towards that practice change.
What are the main risks that you hear from growers as you're meeting with them? What are some of the main risks? You mentioned going from a conventional till to a lower till practice. What risks are inherent in that practice change and some of the others?
Yeah, so there's a perceived yield drag that comes with both no-till and min-till. That if you take that tillage out, there will be a yield hit there. And what I and many others like myself have found is that when we manage it correctly, that doesn't always have to be the case. Even the guys that were selling the no-till and the min-till practices, they would admit that, there can be a 3-year yield drag in a transition period while your soils are restructuring and getting that better system going. But, we've found that in years now that we've got these hybrids that are, just power through about anything, between that and the lessons that we've learned in previous transitions, we don't necessarily see that. A lot of that is crop rotation can take care of it. I have not seen consistent yield drag with soybeans no-tilled into corn stalks, or vice versa, corn no-tilled into bean stubble. So just by, inserting that rotation into your system, which many people do anyway, that can get ahead of it. We start talking no-till corn on corn. Well, now we're talking a little bit trickier system. Now we need to, start talking about different planter setups, maybe some different fertility aspects. But even so, we can do that with success without seeing yield drag, as long as we know how to manage it.
John, let's jump into, since we're talking about tilling, Let's jump into some soil health, some soil science and fertility questions. Someone told me one time, I think it was Dr. Carl Wyant at one point, mentioned to me that tilling is like a tornado for the microbiome in the soil. So the microbiome is trying to thrive, and it's what's causing the soil to be healthy. And every time you go through and till that, it's like a tornado coming through town and destroying all the buildings. And so it takes time to rebuild those buildings and those houses and those condominiums for the microbiome. Is that an accurate description? And one of the advantages of going to low till is to try to reduce the number of tornadoes?
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I've never heard that one before, but that's a good analogy for understanding. I was going to use the analogy of, these are houses that are built and you're going through and disrupting those houses. So that's a perfect analogy for that. The idea is that soil structure is being built over time, and that's being built based on what's happening in your soil, the crops that are being grown, the water, the nutrients, every pass, every drive across the field, everything that's going on above the surface is affecting things below the surface as well. And so understanding, the impact of tillage on that, it plays a large role. And to piggyback with that, when we talk about cover cropping, I was just reading the other day that somebody did a meta-analysis, looking at 60 different journal articles and said, the impact of cover crops on the abundance, the activity, and the diversity of soil microbes is just enormous. And so again, you piggyback those two practices together, and you're creating a factor that's larger than each of them separate or each of them combined. And so that maybe you can look at that as like some sort of force that's helping people rebuild those houses, or something that's bringing those people back into that town after that disaster, because, it's increasing the soil structure and the health of that soil, over a longer period of time. And that's easy, to talk about in soil structure. And again, when I talk to a farmer, and if I start talking about soil structure, I think the nerd alert goes off, and maybe he says, "Well, that's great. I understand you're excited about this, but that's probably not my dollars and cents." But then I try to relate it back to something like water infiltration or nutrient cycling. And you say, okay, what does this look like if I'm able to keep the structure that allows optimum water and air in the soil, to allow nutrients to be available and not lost through the soil profile, if they're maintained and captured in that root zone, if water is able to infiltrate into the soil surface instead of running off? What does that mean? I think across the U.S., we've seen in a year like this, the value of water, right? The value of water has never been higher. The drought that we're seeing across the U.S., the record heat waves that we've seen, I think these are huge impacts on, future crop production, and these practices that help build that community underneath the soil. I think it's going to go a long way to enable crop production to be sustainable in the long term.
And understanding that is important because it's almost counterintuitive. You think, I want to get more water and more nutrients into my soil profile, so I'm going to go through there and disc it. I want to alleviate that hard pan that's on top, or whatever, the compaction that you get from going through the field. And if I till it, that's going to help me with my water infiltration. And that's also going to help with the fertilizers going into the effective root zone. But in fact, if you pay attention and you can rewind this podcast and listen to what John just said, that it's actually better to have a healthier soil and keep that microbiome in the soil healthy. And that's going to help with water infiltration, the structure. And we can get into some of the cover cropping and how that helps with structure as well, and keeping the air, water, and nutrients in that effective root zone. I think that this whole subject is fascinating to me.
And I'll even expound upon that. Looking at soil microbiome as well, there's a lot of misunderstanding or just lack of knowledge of what that even pertains to, right? If I talk to a grower about a soil microbiome, again, does the nerd alert go off, or does that sound like fancy language that's just made to confuse a grower or, confuse the facts? And when we look at what that soil biology and the soil structure does, that's responsible for driving nutrients into the roots and into the plant, right? So again, it's making the plant more efficient at uptake of those nutrients. It's making the plant more resistant to disease, having an abundant and diverse microbe population in the soil is helping the plant resist disease in the future. And so these are real world, dollars and cent conversations around these practices that I think sometimes get lost in the fancy, 50-cent words.
We've kind of moved away from the carbon farming advantage to the agronomic advantage. Steve, talk to us. If you have a healthy soil structure, and these fungi and bacteria are just alive, the populations are diverse, and they're building these big metropolitan areas in the soil, how does that help with carbon sequestration, and how can we monetize that?
Yeah, so when you've got those good fungal interactions going on with the plants, you're building healthier, more robust plants. That's more plant matter above and below ground, and that's where a large portion of our carbon will come from, is decaying plant material. And when you have those good symbiotic relationships, that's where that'll come from.
Let's talk about that organic matter. We're talking about topsoil and organic matter. If you're having this symbiotic relationship between the microbiome and the organic material that's decomposing, talk to us a little bit about that, Steve.
That's one of my favorite topics with these conservation practices, is the topsoil preservation, because, there's that Paul Harvey quote where, man, despite his artistic pretensions, his sophistication, and his many accomplishments, owes his existence to that 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And when we stop and think about that, that's a pretty heavy statement. All of this life that we have around us that we've built up all comes back to, well, how are we going to get our food? And it's because of that layer of topsoil. So, and one of the good visuals that I always like to throw at guys is, if you're in an area with any kind of topography to it that's been farmed for a while, a lot of times if you can identify the old fence lines, you'll see an unevenness between those fields. And that's not how the native prairie was back before we dominated it and started farming it. There were not those 3 to 6 foot drop-offs from field to field. We've done that. So, that's an extreme case of showing what can happen over time when we maybe don't pay quite as much attention to, preserving these soils as we should. And there's really no good way of replacing that once it's gone. So, when we go in there with tillage and we stir things up, I should say, irresponsible tillage, not when you're doing things in front of big rains and, going up and down the hills. That'll loosen that soil up. The big rain comes and it washes away. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a big gully that you see, but year after year, little by little, you can end up with that large amount of soil lost. So, with these practices we're promoting, it, increases that soil structure and can get more living roots in the ground and shield the ground with more plant material on top. You can keep that soil locked in place. That's been just huge.
I love that quote from Paul Harvey. Steve, I think that you're too young to even know who Paul Harvey is, though. I don't know if you ever listened to Paul
I've
Harvey.
Heard the recordings.
Okay. Thank goodness for those old radio recordings. I used to listen to Paul Harvey on my uncle's farm when I was working on their farm during the summer. We would stop and listen to. He would have 3 separate clips throughout the day on the AM radio station that we used to listen to, and that was kind of our signal that we needed a break. Was it's Paul Harvey time. Hey, John, talk to me a little bit about. Maybe you can help me, and maybe most growers know this, but we've all heard of the Great Dust Bowl that went through the Midwest. Tell us, what was that? And how are we building back our topsoils or our soil health despite that Dust Bowl? What did we do to create it? And how are we doing better?
Yeah, that's a good topic. I remember teaching Soils 101 in grad school, and part of that class was showing the students, freshmen and sophomore students, a video from the Dust Bowl. And it was basically showing just the widespread erosion that was going on, and, farmers chasing rabbits out of their fields, trying to find whatever vegetation they could find to feed on. And like I said, it was always a very good visual to talk about, the value of soil. And Steve did a great job talking about topsoil and the value that has. And I like to use the analogy of when you lose topsoil, it's like you're diluting your whole soil profile, right? The topsoil a lot of times has the highest organic matter or a lot of the carbon and organic matter in it. And so if you lose that top part, you're essentially diluting your entire root zone or your entire soil zone of organic matter because you're losing the highest percentage. Again, that's where the roots and everything are growing. And so these practices like reduced tillage and cover cropping, what they're essentially doing is creating a protective layer for that soil. And so by doing these practices, you're inhibiting the wind or other factors, rain, from pushing soil away from the surface and moving it along. In Michigan here, we see, in the winter is usually a good visual because we have a lot of snow here. And, a lot of times you can pick out, even underneath the snow, which fields have cover crops on them just by watching the dirt that is being moved with the snow across the field or across the road. And so that's really a good visual. You can say, well, that's a dirty snow field, and we kind of know why that's happening there and not across the road. And so again, sometimes that's a good visual just to demonstrate the impact of this and look at it on a larger scale. Like I said, even in the winter when you think, hey, it's not as important or there's not much going on, that's something that's pretty visual for guys to see.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating story and a learning opportunity for us here in the United States. Steve, we're talking about some of these practices that growers are maybe at some level practicing a little bit. We're asking them to take it to the next level. What are some of the growing pains that you hear from growers or that you can understand that they're going to be going through? Because let's make this clear. Both John and Steve are agronomists. They're in the farming community. They have farming backgrounds, which is nice. But what are some of the growing pains that you see, and how does Agoro help ease those growing pains?
Yeah, the equipment costs are one that I get on a pretty repetitive basis there. The biggest change that needs to happen in the equipment lineup, if we're talking about the practices that we're looking at, are on that planter. And like I had said, if you're looking at something like a corn on corn no-till scenario where you're going to be needing to look at a starter system, pretty advanced trash whippers, especially in cover crop scenarios, if you get into the tall cover crops, you'll want a certain design with the swept back tines that can, cost a little more money. But that initial equipment changeover has been one of the growing pains, knowing what to look for in that. And there is that time that it takes to get your soils restructured that, we had talked about that perceived yield drag for those first 3 years, back in the olden days, I guess I'll call it, of transitioning over. But a lot of that was from the soils restructuring and that carbon cycle getting kicked back into high gear. With less tillage, you're going to have higher levels of residue. And that's where some of that, yield drag may have come from in the corn scenarios, nitrogen tie up or, cooler soils, more residue to plant through. So, getting over those first 3 years of, and doing it in a well-managed way, that's been I guess the repetitive growing pain. So the most important thing to get over that would be, to talk to someone and get that planter set up well, and use the data that's out there, use the resources that are out there, the people that have done it already, call and brainstorm with them and, see what you can do to save yourself some headache with it.
Hey, Steve, I'm sure you see the same thing where you are, but the number of modifications that growers are making to their planters are really extraordinary, right? The different ways that they're accomplishing the same, to get over this hurdle are really amazing. And I never lose the excitement of going to these field meetings and seeing a grower with pictures on their phone of how they modified their planter to be able to work through high residue or, plant in certain, row spacing in order to make it work.
Mm-hmm. Oh, same here as well.
Yeah.
I think that farmers are some of the most ingenious, creative people out there with welders, right? I mean, they can create anything. I used to just just be baffled by what they could create. They'd say, I have an idea, and within a half a day, they've built it in their shop. It's crazy. Steve, you mentioned the expense of the equipment to transition to some of these practices. Is there something that Agoro does that can help them maybe justify or help with that cost?
There's the carbon credit revenue itself. That's the large portion of the financial support that we can give for that. But the bigger thing is that the grower that's undergoing these practice changes has his true end goal in sight. His end goal is not going to be that carbon dollar that we're going to be able to provide. His end goal is going to be a more robust cropping system with hopefully steadier yields, more resistant to, extreme weather changes. So that's what we have to keep in mind here, is that we're not trying to set ourselves up for that carbon dollar, but we should be trying to set ourselves up for a more resilient farm.
I think that's brilliant. And the more that I talk to growers, one of their key worries that keeps them up at night is, how can I keep this farm within the family? How can I keep the legacy of the farm going? And I think some of these changes, although, John, as you put it, no change is easy. Those are oxymoron statements or words. I think growers are willing to do things that can sustain that legacy. And I think you're absolutely right, Steve. This carbon farming, the credits that Agoro is helping, that's only part of it. Agoro is out there with their agronomists that are helping the growers understand the longevity of soil health, the agronomics, and the benefit of sequestering carbon and getting paid for that. And that's what I've been really impressed with. John, before we finish off, what else do you think that a grower in this corn belt in the northern regions of the U.S. Should know?
Yeah. So one of the hurdles, or one of the challenges that we sometimes run into in our area, is knowing what cover crop species to plant, right? And I always say that's a wide topic, and cover crops can do a whole host of things to alleviate problems, to add benefits. But again, the discussion around cover crops always has to be, I don't always like to throw this word around, but it has to be holistic, right? It has to be understanding, well, what do I want to accomplish? How am I going to be able to plant this? When am I going to be able to plant this? How? And then also, how am I going to be able to terminate this? So, I've had agronomists tell me again and again, don't ever plant something until you know how you're going to kill it or terminate it. And so that's, again, sometimes a rookie mistake that we see made all the time, just that you get excited about a species without fully considering all the aspects of it. And so a lot of times that's really where we, have the discussion with growers in the planning phase of, okay, we've identified that we're going to try a cover crop. Is it going to be single species, multiple species? When are we going to plant it, and how are we going to terminate it? And so that's an important part of our discussions. And again, that's the agronomic support that Agoro is offering. Not a pamphlet or a booklet for the grower to go through on their own, but the regular visits or the regular communications with an agronomist in their area to help them through this. And you touched earlier, Scott, on the changes that need to be made. I know no industry or no people that are better at adapting to things or making changes than farmers, right? We see that on a daily basis. Yeah. I worked for farmers for 10 years and they're making changes to their fertilizer plan, their crop rotation, their planting date, their equipment, all these aspects of their operation. They're used to change, right? So it's not that farmers can't make this change, is that, do we want them to make this change on their own and learn the hard way? Or do we want somebody like Agoro to come in with them, help them make this change a smart way, and, overcome some of these hurdles quicker and easier than possibly on their own?
I love that you reminded us about that Agoro is not just a pamphlet. We're not just saying, hey, come get rich on carbon credits. We put people in the fields with the grower that know the agronomics, know the regions, know the crops, know the cover crops, and they can work alongside your local agronomist to come up with a plan that can help you be more successful or have a greater chance of success. So thank you for reminding us about that. Steve, what else do we need to cover before we finish up here?
As we were talking, I had two more, common concerns come up in my head. The one being compaction issues. How will a farmer alleviate compaction if you say he signs up for no-till in some program and he can't till the ground up anymore? And I'll throw a note in there on some crop tours. I'll call them Steve's Illinois crop tours that he's done over the last couple weeks here. But I've put my boots on some farms that have been doing these practices long term, and the couple that come to mind are the ones that were in them for 5 and 7 years. And on these visits, I've taken along the soil penetrometer and a water infiltration test, and I've done some in-field checks with them. And I tell you, I have a hard time in most cases finding any density layers in those fields that have been long-term no-till with heavy cover crop use. And they're not small equipment, run over fields. They're large operators with big heavy equipment making the same tracks that everybody else is. And try as I might, I'll even look for a wheel track in some of those to take a penetrometer reading out of. And I get a little resistance there in the first top 3 inches, but then it just slides the whole rest of the depth of the probe.
Wow.
So that's been a big eye opener for me as to, just what happens when we get over that hump and get these soils restructured. And the other thing I'll throw in is the common complaint with cover crops. It's another management step that it takes. You've got, the cost of the seed and then the cost of termination. That's been a big talk this year with the increased herbicide costs. But on the farms that I've been on, 2 in particular, they burned off their tall rye cover crop after they no-tilled beans into them with just straight glyphosate, no residual chemicals at all. And then they came in with a post spray about 4 to 5 weeks later, and they had both made the note that on that post trip through the field, they thought they were wasting their time because they just didn't have any weeds to kill hardly.
Wow.
And you think about that. Well, okay, I might have a little more cost in that burn down, but really no residual pre, and the field is that clean. There is some money to be saved when these things are managed right.
And that's what it's really all about, is that ROI, right? Am I going to be profitable?
Mm-hmm.
And if we can create some systems and some changes that can help these farms become more profitable, I think that's the overall goal. Guys, thank you so much. If someone is listening and they're thinking, you know what, all of this resonates with me, I want to know more. Or if they're on the fence, I want to know more, where can they go to get more information, or how can they get in touch with you guys or other agronomists within Agoro?
AgoroCarbon.com is our website. And within that, you'll find a whole host of information about our programs, some of the practices. And then there's a section down at the bottom of the page. I believe it's still there. And that's the Carbon Farming Knowledge Hub. And that'll go through a variety of topics that a lot of us agronomists across the U.S. have written or talked about. And it'll even have some outside sources to look at, information about some of these practices, some of these changes, and, additional information about, what it takes to adopt some of these practices. So that's been a really great resource. If you have a specific question and you say, hey, it's Friday night at 11 p.m. and I'm going to sit around and I'm looking at the internet. Hey, I want to learn something tonight. And so that's a great way to get some knowledge or get some information that way, and maybe raise some more questions and further your progress along this path.
And John and Steve have written articles there. You can go and look at those articles. I've read a couple, and they're not encyclopedia length articles. They're very to the point, very well written, a quick read, and you can get a lot of knowledge there. So I guess that's why our marketing department at Agoro called it the Knowledge Hub. That's smart marketing, John and Steve. Hey, thank you so much for coming on and teaching us a little bit more about the Corn Belt, especially in that northern part of the United States, and some of the common issues or hurdles that a grower may be thinking or may be facing, and how Agoro is willing to coach them along the way and help them to be successful. not just to get involved in selling carbon credits, which is a benefit, but also helping the growers continue their farm and make it more healthy. So thanks, guys, for joining us. So we just finished the actual episode, and we had an after discussion, and we thought you might enjoy this. Recently, Steve went down to visit Ashley Bruner's family farm. Ashley works for Agoro in the marketing department, and she's been listening into the episode. And I thought it would just be interesting for you to hear the interaction of what happened on this visit that Steve had. Steve, did you go down? I didn't know that Ashley had a family farm, and you took some time out of your day and went down to the family farm there. What were you doing? How did she twist your arm?
Well, I know that her and her family were doing some of the practices that we're talking about doing. I've got interest in them. And, she had mentioned there was a neighbor down there too that had been doing them for quite some time. And I thought, well, it'd be kind of fun to, take that new penetrometer toy that I got and poke around and see what the compaction areas looked like and do a couple water tests. And it was like a field trip.
Ashley, what did you find? I mean, you started in this practice changes. Has it been easy for you and your family?
Well, I can't take any credit because I've done none of the work except for when I'm visiting home from Colorado. So here, but my family's done no-till beans for years. So that wasn't a new practice change, but they did start adding cover crops 3 years ago now. And so Steve came down and did water infiltration tests and penetrometer tests in the conventional fields, as well as the fields where we've had the no-till and cover crops going for a few years. And it was a really interesting thing to see because there's a marked difference. He tested it at multiple points throughout the field where you can kind of see where there's a lot more traffic towards the edges versus more on the interior side. And just the differences were pretty remarkable between the two. And what Steve didn't hear was the colorful commentary about some of the stress of getting the new crops to come up through the cover crops that, Steve had a good analogy to use about what you should do when you're transitioning that he mentioned.
Was this a Paul Harvey quote, Steve, or did you bring some of your own philosophy? What did you tell her?
This was Steve's philosophy with soybeans, especially because he was very concerned because his soybeans were coming up a little, spindlier than we sometimes prefer them seeing. And there was an old neighbor of mine that said, if you plant no-till beans, and he was a hardcore, adamant no-tiller for, I think he was like a 20-year no-tiller at that point in time, 10 years ago when he told me it. But he said, you got to plant them and go on vacation for about 2 or 3 weeks because you'll do nothing but kick yourself and try to talk yourself into plowing them up and replanting. So, and, once they get through that ugly period, they kind of plump up and they look just as good as, the worked field next to them, and they yield the same, if not better. But yeah, that can be a pretty tough period to look at them.
And Steve, you were saying that there's an advantage once you have that cover crop mat down on water retention. Is that correct? Did I understand that right?
Yeah, what water retention's one of them. In the drought year when we were driving around, I could see it all of. I think it was 2 years ago we turned off pretty hot and dry, and then this year too we had that horrible dry and hot June. But you could see from field to field the ones that were no-tilled and the ones that were worked up. And the corn especially with the amount of leaf rolling, it's been eye-opening this year.
Well, I remember as a kid, there was sayings like no till, no skill, people used to say, and now it's a really common practice. And so it makes you wonder if it's just going to take some time for things like cover crops to become more prominent.
Oh, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a learning curve. And I think that's what usually leads to some of the failures or the disheartening feelings is that sometimes growers are learning the hard way that they can't do everything the same and then just incorporate cover crops. It needs to be part of a system and with considerations for the whole thing. So,
yeah, and I would say that I was told by my family members that they did have a small dip in yield the first year that they transitioned, but their input costs were lower. And so they came out still a little bit ahead of what they would have been completely conventionally. So there was a yield dip, but so was the number of passes and costs of other inputs that they were putting on the field.
Well, that's good to know. My big question for you, Ashley, is did your family go on vacation? Did they heed Steve's prophetic statement?
No, they sat around and stressed about it.
Maybe next year. Maybe next year they can plan a good vacation. You've been listening to the Agoro Carbon Farming Podcast, where we bring you knowledge on how to sustainably and profitably transform farming through carbon cropping. To learn more about how you can become a partner, visit us at agorocarbonalliance.com or follow us on our many social media channels: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn.